Yes. All right. Thank you for that introduction there. So, again, my name is Austin Avison. I'm finishing up my MS in clinical psychology right now at Eastern, and I also have a Master's of Arts in comparative religion from Western Michigan. So, today we'll essentially be presenting a broad sort of theoretical model that is looking at these sort of proposed biological, psychological, and sociological influences into sort of broadly concerning personality, religiosity, and broad sort of social and cultural evolutionary processes that account for sort of their emergence and looking at sort of the underlying functional significance of religion and personality in particular. So, why is it that the capacity for religiosity and spirituality and culture exist and are universal across human cultures poses a question of their functional significance. And within the theory that we're sort of going to present is that accounting for the multiple factors that have essentially contributed to their emergence is ultimately requires us to look to sort of the evolutionary past as to why it is that these capacities have emerged and what function they broadly serve within human culture and society, right? So some of the questions that we sort of seek to answer are like, what are the sources of human and collective identities? What influences the emergence, structural content, and function of sociocultural systems, including religiosity and the capacity for religiosity and spirituality? What components then contribute to culture's formation and what factors contribute to its propagation and transformation? And so the theory we present is that sociocultural, psychological, and biological processes interact in a complementary manner, influencing the divergence, emergence of diverse cultural products, worldviews, and identities. So it's proposed that religiosity has served a central function in the emergence of human collective societies and approaches religiosity as involving the interaction between social, cultural, psychological, and biological processes and components. And so the model that we put forward, right, is broadly biopsychosocial, right? It's these interactive processes between biology, genetics, psychological processes and factors, and broader social and environmental context in which all of these are essentially viewed as emerging from. And so really sort of highlighting the social and environmental context in which are unique psychologies on an individual level, but also more broadly within sort of group context emerges. So highlighting this social and environmental context while also considering this sort of gene environment interactions and transactions that ultimately are sort of resulting in the end product in which we see and serve as sort of the basis for change and transformation. And so accounting for really sociocultural evolution is really this process of social change, right? It's the definition of culture as information capable of affecting individuals' behavior that they acquire from other members of their species through learning, imitation, and other forms of social interaction, right? So it's viewing it as following this similar process of evolution, right? It's change in response to environmental pressures, but it's viewing this as change and the ability to gain information as being something that is socially mediated through our cultural and social context in which we are essentially raised. And so, essentially, accounting for sort of the behavioral genetics is what is necessary to understand really how it is that this environment is sort of operating to actually affect behavior broadly. And so the question and challenge that sort of presents itself in the academic and scientific study of religion, right, is what is religion? What are we talking about? So some broad sort of historical definitions that I sort of operationally are using within this research. Essentially, I'll draw our attention to the third one is that religion, like culture, is the symbolic transformation of experience. In the fifth, by Durkheim, in that religion is the self validation of a society by means of myth and ritual. So I don't necessarily pose a single definition of what constitutes sort of religiosity in this research, but sort of approaching it from a very sort of broad additive approach to understanding religion rather than sort of a reductionary account in that way. And so the psychological relevance of religion, culture, and society, right? Sociocultural systems inherently involve psychological processes such as ideals, values, practices, and both symbolic and material cultural products. And that these are present across all universal groups of individuals, but that great variance essentially exist between the different cultural products of different groups of individuals and societies. And so psychological research shows us that the basic psychological processes, such as self-conceptions and cognitive processes, differ as a function of different social and cultural groups. And one perspective that is presented by Nerezen is that material and symbolic culture are the cumulative result of human sociocultural and psychological activities. But the key is that genetic differences amongst groups are minimal, and that the variance between groups is too substantial for genetic evolution to provide and account for. In the span of time in which social change is able to come about is also too short, in which to attribute genetic bases for the basis of broad social and cultural shifts that have taken place, even looking in the past 100 years, right? Why is it that the contemporary cultural environment that we find ourselves in is drastically different from even just 100 years ago, right? This is not sort of genetics that can account for like why these profound changes have taken place and are able to take place in such short spans of human history. And so this is where we have to sort of go to this sociocultural view of evolution and social change. And so cultural evolutionary processes essentially follow what we view akin to that of basic biological evolution, right? It's variation, selection, and retention akin to natural selection, right? And so evolutionary thinking is a necessary component to understand how genetic and cultural evolution are bidirectionally influenced. And so there is a great deal of studies that have looked at sort of the genetic underpinnings of, be it religious affiliation or religious sort of attitudes and inclinations. And so while it is that religious affiliation has not necessarily found to be heritable, while broad sort of religious attitudes and interests have been identified to have a significant genetic component, in addition to political and personality characteristics as well carrying a genetic component. And so, again, it's unlikely that religious affiliation in terms of an organized sort of engagement with religion is unlikely to be heritable, while it has been found that religious attitudes do hold a significant component. So identical twins that have been reared apart have been found to develop similar personalities along with religious attitudes, and that essentially genetic effects account for upwards of 50% of the variance in religious attitudes and interest. And this has been replicated in 3 studies by Bouchard, Donofrio, and Waller. And so it's that cultural evolution essentially shapes human cognitive abilities for cultural learning, and in the process have made humans stand alone in the animal kingdom as a cultural dependent series, though following divergent cultural evolutionary trajectories, right? And this is sort of viewing how the particular and unique social and broad just environmental context in which different groups of individuals are subject to different sort of environmental pressures, right? This is one factor that can account for sort of this broad cultural diversity that we see even amongst sort of a simple dichotomy of Western and Eastern sort of modes of culture and expressions of culture. And so we use this approach that was presented by Nerezen and Babolia in essentially examining the formation and function of religion and personality, that this, in terms of sort of different modes of religiosity, right, be it sort of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Shinto, and so forth, why is it that very sort of different fundamental explanations as to sort of the origins of the world, our sort of function within it, how it is that we should organize ourselves and engage with other individuals within our societies. Why is it that these sort of very different accounts have emerged, right? And so there are sort of a number of theories, right? Is this sort of religious innovation, right? Particular individuals sort of presenting a different way of thinking that answers sort of these questions. But what are these sort of environmental context in which these ideas emerge that accounts for sort of this great variation that we see in like what it is that we're talking about, be it religiosity or spirituality as well? And so it's culture is essentially emerging when information is being transmitted not genetically but socioculturally through social learning mechanisms. And that is what is essentially key into this sort of transmission, but then also transformation of essentially religious ideals and values over time, because essentially the process of transmission is not one that is of faithful replication of the sort of original ideals and so forth, but changes that take place in conjunction with sort of new environmental pressures that are unique to a particular generation that differs from those of the past, right? And viewing religion as this sort of dynamic process that is able to be adapted to the particular pressures and needs of individuals and groups of individuals during different times in our evolutionary history, ultimately. So again, why is it that the modern cultural environment is so drastically different from the historical environment of 10,000, 1,000, or even 1,000 years ago, right? It's cultural evolution that is able to account for these changes, right? It is not genetics that is able to account for why it is that the contemporary environment we exist is so different from the social and cultural environment of even 100 years ago, right? Changes that have come about in terms of beliefs about the roles of women in society, right? Very different. What accounts for these changes in like the fundamental social and cultural values that any given society holds at a particular time, and what sort of accounts for these changes is really this process of social and cultural evolution, right? And so it's essentially selecting for traits, norms, or practices that are essentially reducing competition amongst individuals within a social group, right? Cultural evolution is moving towards this production or organization that is adaptive, right? Adaptive for sort of the survival of, be it individuals and groups as well. And so it's something that's promoting solidarity and identifies differential success in social groups as well too, right? If this is a social group whose cultural evolutionary trajectory is one that is reducing competition between individuals within the group, reducing conflict between individuals, and enabling sort of wide-scale cooperation, this is going to be a group that is going to be more sort of successful, as opposed to one in which sort of the social and cultural products are not necessarily leading to this sort of greater social collaboration or prosociality amongst individuals. And so what is fascinating in the theories of Nereisen and Babolia is that religion is likely one factor that can account for how it is that large-scale societies have been able to emerge amongst genetically unrelated individuals. So within humans' cultural and evolutionary past, right, groups of individuals were typically kinship groups of genetically related individuals, small groups of individuals living sort of, be it nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyles. It is likely that religion is in its sort of formation of an ethical and moral systems, right? These gods or God that was concerned with the behavior of individuals that regulated and posed regulations around our behavior that enabled us to cooperate in a way that was likely not possible prior to sort of the advent of, be it organized religiosity, that gave sort of prescriptions around behavior that enabled us to collaborate in a pro-social way in large groups of individuals, right? And so it, to some extent, now we see that in sort of the advancement of secular states, right, that we view it to some extent that the capacity for large-scale cooperation amongst genetically unrelated individuals is sort of built upon this, be it religiosity, religion, spirituality, and so forth, but that there is sort of a novel change that is taking place within our social and cultural evolution that has moved from a sort of religious mode of social and organization to one that is based around secularism, right? Or be it sort of broad partisan political ideologies, right? Like democratic engagement, justice, and sort of these ideals, while being secular in nature, poses questions into sort of what is taking place within social and cultural evolution. What is unique to the time in which we exist that has sort of necessitated this change or merger, right? In religious studies, a number of theories present that religiosity was what was the best thing that was sort of present at a particular time to answer questions about why are we here, how do things work, what is the nature of existence, how have things sort of come about, and that it's science now that is able to answer these questions in a way, is able to answer them in a more definitive way than religion was able to, or answers them in sort of a very different way than as religion has historically done. And so I'm realizing I'm getting shorter here, so I'm just gonna continue on. And so there's really interesting research that has come about looking at how it is that unique particular cultural values of societies, in particular that of individualistic and collectivistic values, modify rates or modify sort of the expression of genes as well. So it's essentially found that the presence of collectivism in conjunction with the short form of the serotonin transporter gene, we find that in societies with collectivistic cultures, which on average have higher rates of the short form of the serotonin transporter gene, which is associated with higher rates of mood disorders. And so we find that in collectivistic societies, which have a higher genetic predisposition for mood disorders, we find that the presence of collectivism essentially moderates that. And so we find in the short form of the serotonin transporter gene in individualistic societies higher rates of essentially mood disorders. Now, in collectivistic societies, in individuals with that short form of the serotonin transporter gene, we're finding lower rates of mood disorders. So looking at how the presence of cultural values can moderate the predisposition for mood disorders, again, is pointing to this really complex interaction that is observed between biology, genetics, culture, and cultural values. And so it's essentially, we promote a view that it is the interaction between biology, genetics, and these broad sociocultural processes that accounts for essentially this broad diversity that we see, that it is the unique sort of environmental pressures and challenges within particular locations and particular times that necessitates the emergence of sort of novel forms of, be it social and cultural products that arise to meet the unique demands of individuals and societies during the times in which they are ultimately existing. So I appreciate everyone's time, and I hope we can take a few questions or so. Right. And so that's from Voltaire. So he was writing, there was a really controversial paper that was published anonymously in his time that essentially promoted a very sort of conspiratorial view that like God was invented for like social control and so forth. And so he's writing in sort of a reply of defending that God in sort of a formal Christianity is something that indeed does exist, but his argument is that even if God did not exist, it is something that would have been necessary to invent for society to work. And so he is promoting sort of a similar view that I present in that religion serves this very it serves a basic psychological and social function in enabling sort of pro-social collaboration and answering historically, right? It was religion that was able to answer these sort of fundamental questions of who am I, why are we here, why does the world exist, right? And so this is something that has served a necessary function within individual psychology, but also broader sort of social collaboration and engagement. So, yeah. Thank you.